Well, hello and welcome to another Sunday morning coffee with Dr. Childress. I have my owl cup today for coffee. Today, I'm going to be talking about what I'm doing in July of 2026 here, which is talking to my psychologists in the field. Um, the situation for the parents is that you're in a captured system, institutional capture and institutional betrayal. And it's a closed system. You're being offered only forensic custody evaluations and clinical diagnostic assessments are being withheld from the parents and the courts by the psychologists who work in the family courts. And that's extremely problematic professional practice. And so the parents you're kind of going around in a circular loop that I've watched for 15 years, a circular loop of destruction. Um, Whereas I'm not, okay, I'm on a linear path. And this linear path has arrived to the point where I'm now in discussions with my own, some top tier forensic custody evaluators in positions of authority. And it's so far it's not a productive conversation. It's just my expressing my concerns and their um, denial that the concerns are present. So that's the current state of the dialogue in uh, July of 2026. And so I just want to tell you about that a little bit and let you know what's going on this Sunday. So fundamentally, here's the issue. Forensic custody evaluations need to end. And that's going to be problematic for all the forensic custody evaluators who earn their income streams and professional standing and things from forensic custody evaluations. However, that remains the fact of the situation. And a special IRB institutional review board, a special IRB panel needs to be um, initiated to examine the practice of forensic custody evaluations in the family courts. And let me just say something about that. The practice of forensic custody evaluations is an experimental assessment procedure developed in the 1980s in response to the rise in divorce rates. The traditional role of doctors is diagnosis and treatment, whereas these custody evaluators, this group, a guild, separated themselves from traditional healthcare services, mental health care services, and developed this own quasi-judicial role for themselves, which is an experimental role for doctors, and then developed an experimental assessment procedure for that experimental role. It's never received any oversight. It's never received a risk-benefit analysis when compared to clinical diagnostic assessments. It's never um, identified the protections needed for the parents and children who are a vulnerable population in the family courts. And so we need to get a professional review on the practice of forensic custody evaluations, especially in light of the New York Blue Ribbon Commission findings. And so it's entirely appropriate for the AFCC through their board of directors to request from the American Psychological Association and HSRP, Human Subjects Research Protection, a review of the practice of forensic custody evaluations to examine for a risk benefit. But particularly the question would center around should the practice continue, but also what protections would be warranted for the vulnerable population of parents and children in the family courts. Protections relative to research studies conducted, but also protections relative to just the population. And especially when you have this experimental role and an experimental assessment procedure being conducted on them. And so somebody needs to get eyes on the situation, and that would be IRB, which is Human Subject Research Protections, HSRP, and the APA, who has broad authority over the field. So if the AFCC Board of Directors were to make that request of the APA and HSRP, we could convene a special panel to review the practice of forensic custody evaluations with an eye to answer that question about vulnerable populations. That's what needs to happen. And until that happens, there needs to be a moratorium placed on forensic custody evaluations until we're reassured that they're not dangerous and harmful to children and destroying children's lives, potentially disastrous consequences. The other thing that needs to happen is clinical diagnostic assessments needs to be provided to parents and the courts. And that's just basic healthcare. Okay. Now, the forensic custody evaluators, they are the guild, the people who are in the family courts. That provides psychological services in the family courts. Now, if they wish to do their custody evaluation approach, they can do that, but they still need to provide clinical diagnostic assessments. The psychologists in the family courts need to provide the litigant parents and the court with a diagnostic assessment. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be specific custody evaluators if that's what they want to continue to do. However, they must identify which psychologists are in the family courts providing the diagnostic assessment. They cannot simply withhold diagnosis and treatment and provide only the forensic custody evaluation. That's not okay as a psychologist in the field to withhold mental health services from the parents and children and the courts. And so that's the other issue, is that clinical diagnostic assessments need to be provided. That's just basic healthcare. And since the forensic psychologists are the ones who are providing mental health services to the parents and children and the courts, they're the ones who are obligated to provide it. So those are my positions, with some additional positions that I've been expressing to the top tier of forensic custody evaluators who are in positions of authority. And so far, they have not adequately responded to any of those concerns. But just to take a look at the support, New York Blue Ribbon Commission, page 4, Google it. In some custody cases, because of a lack of evidence or inability of parties to pay for expensive challenges of an evaluation, defective reports can thus escape meaningful scrutiny and are often accepted by the court with potentially disastrous consequences for parents and children. So let's just dissect that first quote for a second here. So the parents cannot get a second opinion because it's too expensive, the expensive challenges. And so they escape meaningful scrutiny. Well, that's what I provide, the meaningful scrutiny, and I'm using AI to do that now, which is lowering the cost, so it's not such an expensive challenge. But they're producing defective reports. So that's one of my questions to the forensic custody evaluators is, how are you mitigating the production of these defective reports? What steps have you taken since the New York Blue Ribbon Commission to ensure that these defective reports do not escape meaningful scrutiny and then potentially disastrous consequences if the court relies on those decisions? Well, given that there's no IRB review, this is the only review of the practice, courts should not be relying on custody evaluations because they can lead to potentially disastrous consequences. And under Standard 3.10 on informed consent, each custody evaluator should be informing the litigant parents and informing the court that it may result in a defective report that with potentially disastrous consequences if the court relies on it. That's part of informed consent, okay? The informed part. So you are withholding information about the risks from the parent litigants and from the court, and you are providing only that approach to mental health services and are withholding standard healthcare services. We need to get oversight over here, and that's the purview of the APA and HSRP at this point. But they're not going to activate, so it's up to the board of directors of the AFCC, who are a multidisciplinary organization with both legal professionals and mental health professionals. It's up to that board to make that request relative to these findings. And when the board of directors of the AFCC takes a look at these findings to see whether or not the practice should be modified or continued, or about their endorsement of the practice and things, the custody evaluators on the board should recuse themselves because they have a personal financial interest in this continuing. And so the conflict of interest issues on the board of directors are substantial. And the continued participation of the forensic custody evaluators on the board that limits and filters the information being received by the judicial professionals, well, that creates a tremendous conflict of interest for them, but also compromises the integrity of the judicial professionals who are receiving filtered information about a practice that could be dangerous and harmful to children. So let's look at the second quote. New York Blue Ribbon Commission, by an 11-9 margin, a majority of commission members favor elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children and lack scientific or legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence and child abuse. The practice of psychologists should never be dangerous and harmful to children. That should never be a situation. And so the mere fact that a formal committee found that these reports were dangerous and harmful to children would warrant an immediate suspension of that practice pending a more formal review, which IRB and APA request that. And so just that alone, and the findings of the New York Blue Ribbon Commission need to be addressed by the board of directors who have oversight for the AFCC, which is a multidisciplinary agency of attorneys and judicial officers and mental health professionals, as well as other associated professionals. And so they have recommendations to conduct these, how to conduct these. They're putting on courses about how to conduct these. The AFCC is sponsoring a course, how to conduct these examinations, these assessments that are dangerous, harmful to children, and lack scientific and legal value. Well, the AFCC, I sit on a board of directors for a youth and family services organization in Long Beach. And I know that the function of a board of directors is to have oversight of the organization. It's independent oversight. Well, this is directly relevant to your organization, which is endorsing this practice. So the board of directors needs to review this and see if their endorsement in the situations require modification or elimination of this particular practice. But that's going to affect the income stream and the standing of the forensic custody evaluators on the board, so they should recuse themselves from consideration of this issue. But then the board is not getting any mental health information. It's just the legal professionals deciding on a mental health situation. That's where the board should request the APA and HSRP to come in and provide them with an independent analysis of the situation and independent recommendations as to what special protections are warranted for the children and parents in the family courts. Okay, so that's the professional level situation. And that's the situation I'm in discussion with the forensic custody evaluators in right now. I proposed some solutions, such as the AFCC requesting the oversight. There's potential debate if they disagree about the issues. I'm more than happy to debate them on it, online public debate, or a special issue of family court review looking at the clinical challenges to custody evaluations. And by the way, that 11-9 vote, the 9 who voted not to eliminate it wasn't because they thought they were good. It's that they wanted some mental health services rather than nothing. The 11 who voted to eliminate it would rather have no mental health services in the family courts rather than what they're being provided. That's so bad. I should not have to explain the pathology to my colleagues in order to have a professional level discussion with them. And their patients, you, the parents, should never need to explain the pathology to the doctors. Okay, that's a seriously problematic situation on boundaries of competence if you have to explain what the pathology is to your doctor. So it's just a bad situation that needs oversight. Now, here are the ethical issues, or the ethical concerns involved. There's a lot of them. There should be zero, by the way. There should be zero ethical concerns regarding the situation. Here they are. Boundaries of competence, that's a VETA. And so I've got an AI protocol where we can be looking at this boundaries of competence. You upload their VETA and ask the AI to walk it through it in 3 prompts, and it'll give you an analysis of their VETA for boundaries of competence. In attachment pathology, delusional thought disorders, or anything else you identify. And the licensing board should do this proactively. They should request the VETA of all court-involved psychologists and run them through an AI VETA assessment protocol to examine for competence issues and competence concerns, and then do necessary remediation. Standard 2.04, bases for scientific and professional knowledge. So that's, you have to start. Let's start with the DSM-5, okay? Let's start by applying the DSM-5, please, as the established. I don't care if you disagree with diagnosis. Do it anyway, please. Humor me. Just humor me from a healthcare perspective. Let's start applying the DSM-5 and see what happens. Just watch. Just try it. Just try it and see what happens. You're going to get a delusional disorder, factitious disorder imposed on another, and child psychological abuse. Boom. It's going to fall right into place if you apply the criteria of the DSM-5. There is no reason to withhold the diagnostic criteria of a DSM-5. There is no reason to not diagnose a major psychiatric disorder in one of the parents being induced in the child. There's no benefit to that. Okay, if you want to do a custody evaluation, add that on. But apply the DSM-5. I would suggest you apply it also attachment, family systems, personality disorder, all the established knowledge. There is no value in ignorance. And so that's standard 2.04. Standard 9.01, bases for assessment. Their opinions are based on information sufficient to substantiate their findings. 3.04, avoiding harm. If you don't diagnose the pathology, then your risk of misdiagnosis goes up considerably, and that's the harm from misdiagnosis if you don't diagnose anything. Media presentations rely on 2.04 established knowledge, and so that's a violation there when they're teaching courses that don't rely on 2.04. Their students don't know about 2.04. The students aren't competent. And then institutional review, the IRB review, 8.01, this needs IRB review. Informed consent, the courts and the litigant parents need to be informed about the risks and the alternative to a forensic custody. You can't withhold from the court's understanding and the litigant parents that there is an alternative to a forensic custody evaluation, a clinical diagnostic assessment. But don't tell anybody, and we're just not going to give them that, so they have to get only the service we provide. No, That's not okay professional practice. And then a substantial conflict of interest. And I've got a Substack about this, and Claude describes it, and Fable describes the conflict of interest extraordinarily well. And so go over to my Substack, you see the conflict of interest issues. And Claude and we talk about what the solution is, and that IRB review thing. And I've sent that information to the other psychologists, so they're aware of it, about what the solutions are and what needs to happen in the situation. I can't imagine that they're arguing that not applying knowledge is a good thing. No, it's never a good thing to not apply established knowledge. Just apply it. See what happens. If you apply Bowlby, Mnuchin, Beck, Tronick, the DSM-5, see what happens. So conflict of interest. And there's two clauses to conflict of interest, by the way. One is that the psychologist should not accept a position where their personal or financial interests may appear to compromise their objectivity. Well, that's the forensic custody evaluators sitting on their own oversight board, so they're the ones that are overseeing and providing all the standards, and then they're the ones that are benefiting from all of that. And so we need outside psychological input, or the board does, the legal professionals on the board do. And then the second clause to that is that the psychologist shouldn't take positions if it compromises or threatens to exploit the institution. And that's also applicable in this situation. Claude Fable describes it over on my Substack. So this is what needs to be answered. These are the diagnostic questions that need to be answered. And it's up to the psychologists, up to my own, the psychologists who work in the family court, to either answer these questions or identify somebody who will answer these questions for the litigant parents and the courts. Because there's one litigant parent, the targeted parent, and their attorney who want these questions answered. Diagnostic mental health questions. Apply the DSM-5. So it's up to the psychologists who work in the field, the forensic psychologists, to meet the needs of the parents and children and courts for an answer. So the first question is whether when a child's rejecting a parent, is the targeted parent abusing the child in some way, thereby creating the child's authentic attachment pathology towards that parent? If so, tell us what the diagnosis is. If not, then is the allied parent psychologically abusing the child by creating a shared induced persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology in the child? DSM-5 297.1 and 300.19, either or both of which are also the child abuse, V995.51, child psychological abuse. It's a little package. So yes or no. Answer the question. You're the doctor. You're the psychologist. A litigant parent wants to know this. Their attorney wants to know this. And the court wants to know which parent is abusing the child. So either you provide these answers or identify who in the family courts is qualified to provide these answers. If you don't, okay, if you choose not to do this service. And then the subcomponent diagnoses for the allied parent is, does the allied parent have an encapsulated persecutory delusion regarding the targeted parent? And does the child share this persecutory belief, i.e. a fixed and false belief that the child is being malevolently treated in some way by the normal range parenting of the targeted parent? That's a delusional disorder persecutory type. Does the allied parent have a major psychiatric disorder? Yes or no? Can we get a diagnostic assessment from somebody in the mental health field regarding that? No, you cannot. It's being withheld from you so that they can do their custody evaluations that lack scientific value and are dangerous and harmful to children. It is so bad in the mental health system. We need oversight. Can we get oversight over here, please, to determine what's going on and what needs to be fixed? Is there, question two, does the child have a false, factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child by the pathogenic parenting of the allied parent? That's the factitious disorder imposed on another, 300.19, yes or no? We need that's child psychological abuse. Factitious disorder, classically called Munchausen, that's child psychological abuse. So is the child being psychologically abused? And is there spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent? So is the allied parent using the child's induced pathology, the induced persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology, as a weapon of spousal emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent? Yes or no? Is there spousal abuse? They won't answer the question. Please answer that question for us, because the litigant parent wants to know, their attorney wants to know, and the court wants to know, and you're the one who's in the family courts. Your obligation, either do it or identify who is doing it, but you cannot simply ignore the possibility of child abuse and spousal abuse and say, I'm not even going to look because I don't want to do that. That's not okay professional practice. Okay, so when I'm talking to my own, that's not okay. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? You're in positions of authority. The AFCC can do things. They can request oversight. They can do trainings. You want to debate the issue? That's fine. Special issue of the family court review. I'll write an article. You can write articles. So here's the situation. I'm talking to my own. Okay, they're here in direct one-on-one with Dr. Childress. I've worked with top-tier people. I've worked, let me say that for a second. Across my career, you can look at my vita. I've worked top-tier people. Dr. Nectarline in schizophrenia, top expert in schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, major thing. He is like the top expert, and his team around him of all the psychiatrists and social workers and stuff, top-tier professionals. And I was part of that team. Then down in Orange County, after going to Children's Hospital of Los Angeles for training, which is a top-tier training location, and so I went to Children's Hospital, Keck School of Medicine, university affiliated, and so I went to their training program, and then I went to work with Jim Swanson, who is a top-tier ADHD, and his whole team of ADHD people, the therapists, the psychiatrists, and his whole team is top tier. They were one of the lead sites in the MTA study of medication and behavioral interventions back in the 90s. One of the best randomized control studies ever conducted, 6 sites, and they were one of the lead sites. These are top tier ADHD. These are the quality of professionals that I come from into the family courts. So I know what professional practice actually looks like. And Dr. Nectarline's team or Dr. Swanson's team absolutely would be applying the established knowledge. They were on the cutting edge of that, and they valued the established knowledge and ethical standards. Holy cow. They were getting IRB reviews and approvals, and so I know how professionals act and respond. And so I'm talking to the top tier of the forensic custody evaluators, and it's concerning that we have a list of 8 potential ethical violations that need to be addressed and answered, starting with 2.01 competence. Point out on your vita where you're competent. If you're not competent, then that's a basis for a lot of other problems. And so the forensic custody evaluations need to end pending the special IRB review of the practice, and clinical diagnostic assessments need to be provided to the parents and the courts. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this Sunday's coffee talk with Dr. Childress. As you can tell, I'm fairly opinionated about this, because this is active child abuse. Active child abuse. Like somebody's beating the child with an electrical cord right now. There's welts, there's bruises, everything. And it's not being stopped. It's active child abuse and active spousal abuse. I have two dangerous pathologies: dangerous suicide, homicide abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, elder abuse category, dangerous pathologies. And we have to do a risk assessment when we encounter a dangerous pathology. I've got two of them in the family courts: possible child abuse by one parent or the other, and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent. Those need a proper risk assessment. That's standard healthcare. They're not getting that. And AI, let me tell you that AI estimates that the number of misdiagnosed child abuse cases in the last 40 years to be between 300,000 and 1.5 million undiagnosed child abuse cases in the last 40 years because of the forensic custody evaluators and not diagnosing anything. That's staggering. So I was working with Fable. Okay, Fable and I were doing something, and Fable said, "Well, I threw out the number 250,000 just to sort of ballpark it because I was talking about something else." And Fable Claude has this like pushback thing, and it's a little high on. And so it said, well, that 250,000 is not like an established number, so make sure you cite. And I said, okay. And I started arguing with Fable. I said, okay, Fable, what's your estimate? And so then we started arguing for a while. After we've argued, Fable finally comes back with this estimate. It says between 300,000 and 1.5 million. Okay, I said, Fable, you put me through a couple hours of arguing with you, and then you come up with the same estimate, and it says, well, your number is like the low end of, 250,000. Child abuse cases, 250,000. Went over to Gemini and asked about the Catholic sex abuse scandal. That's estimated to be around 10,000 child abuse cases, maybe more. So we're in the tens of thousands of cases of child sex abuse with the Catholic sex abuse scandal. In the family courts, we're talking about 250,000 child abuse cases, up to 1.5 million. Then toss in their parents as a spousal abuse victim. So we're potentially talking about 2 million abuse victims over the last 40 years, undiagnosed, untreated, had their lives destroyed. It's just phenomenal. And so that's what conflict of interest, the custody evaluators don't really want information to come out that what they're doing is highly problematic, but it needs to change. We need a clinical diagnostic assessment. We need to stop the child abuse. Then we need to go back and get the recovery of the now adult children and their parents. So with that, I'm out of here, and I'll talk to you next weekend.